The snow always falls when I go out to carry out a mission, as if the world wants to bury the blood I'm about to spill before it even hits the ground. After this, I'm free. My ascension into the high circles of the Inquisition. That's what High Inquisitor Varkas promised me. The objective is simple. Infiltrate the Iron Kingdom. Kill the Alpha King. Steal the Primal Heart stone he carries. Return. Simple. But when I reach the inner sanctum, there are already screams. There is already fire licking at the stone walls. Not my fire. A rebel ambush has arrived before me, tearing through the king's guards, desperate for the stone. It doesn't matter. I draw my twin steel blades and move forward. Ice and smoke. I step over the bodies of fallen shifters. Some still groan, claws clutching at fatal wounds. Not my problem. I keep going. I reach the throne room doors. A magical backfire, white light and a roar of pressure, shatters the air. The world tilts. The last thing I see before losing consciousness is the fortress crumbling in the blizzard, and the snow. Always the snow. I wake up with a sharp pain in my side. I open my eyes, gray sky, cold stone beneath my back. I look up. He's kneeling beside me. His hands glow with a low, golden heat over my wound. He's using his own life force to heal me. King Alistair sees me wake up. He immediately pulls back, putting distance between us. He looks like the monster they described, yet his eyes are full of a sorrow I don't understand. We stare at each other in silence.
He's exhausted.
I can see it in how his shoulders slump. Then his eyes close. He collapses onto the floor, unconscious from the strain of saving a killer. I stand up with difficulty. My side burns, but I ignore it. I've lived my whole life in pain. I walk toward him. He's unconscious, completely vulnerable. I draw my blade. The metal glints under the dim winter light. It's simple. I finish the mission here. I take the Primal Heart. I return to Varkas. Simple. I raise the weapon over his throat. But something stops me. The snow fell in heavy, silent sheets, masking the fortress of the Iron Kingdom in a shroud of white that matched the cold emptiness in my chest. I moved through the shadows of the outer battlements, a ghost in silk and steel, while the sounds of the winter solstice celebration echoed from the great hall below. Music, strange, rhythmic, and primal, pulsed through the stone walls, a stark contrast to the clinical silence of the Inquisition's halls where I had been raised. High Inquisitor Varkas had been clear. Alistair Blackwood was a beast who fed on shadows, and his death was the only way to secure the light of the realm. I scaled the frozen masonry with practiced ease, my fingers finding purchase in the narrowest cracks of the rock. Every breath I took was a shallow plume of frost, but I felt no cold. Varkas had burned the capacity for such distractions out of me long ago. The mission was a simple machine with 3 moving parts: find the king, take the Primal Heart, and vanish. Slipping through a high-arched window, I found myself in a corridor draped in evergreen boughs and flickering candlelight. The scent of roasting meat and spiced wine filled the air, thick enough to choke someone who wasn't used to the sterile scent of incense and old parchment. I moved with lethal precision, stepping over the shadows cast by the decorative tapestries. The guards were distracted by the festivities, their laughter booming behind heavy oak doors, making my infiltration almost insultingly easy. I reached the balcony, overlooking the great hall. Below, the shifters were gathered in their finery, fur-lined cloaks and shimmering jewels that caught the light of a massive hearth fire. At the center of the room sat King Alistair Blackwood. He didn't look like the snarling monster described in the Inquisition's texts. He looked weary, his broad shoulders carrying a weight that had nothing to do with the crown on his head. As he raised a chalice to toast his people, his eyes scanned the room with a protective intensity that momentarily caused my grip on my twin blades to tighten. He was the target.
He was the beast.
I adjusted my mask and prepared to drop into the chaos of the celebration, a shadow falling into a room full of light. The ascension, Varkas promised, was only a heartbeat away, hidden behind the steady pulse of the Alpha King's throat. I waited for the music to swell, for the moment when the cheers of the crowd would drown out the sound of a dying man's last breath. It was simple. It was always simple. The moment of the strike arrived as the music reached a fever pitch, but before I could descend from the rafters, the world splintered in a way I hadn't calculated. I was coiled to drop, my twin blades already tasting the air, when a concussive roar ripped through the foundation of the fortress. It wasn't the king's guards who reacted first, it was the stone itself, groaning and buckling under the weight of an unexpected siege. A group of masked rebels, neither Inquisition nor Alistair's kin, had breached the eastern wall with a crude, unstable magical explosive. The shockwave tore through the Great Hall, turning the winter solstice celebration into a landscape of fire and jagged shards. I felt the balcony beneath me disintegrate, the ancient wood and cold masonry surrendering to the blast. I tried to twist in midair, my eyes searching for the Alpha King amidst the rising smoke, but a secondary explosion from the ceiling sent a massive support beam careening toward me. The impact was a dull, heavy thud that robbed the air from my lungs. I didn't fall into the hall. I was driven downward through the collapsing floorboards into the darkened cellars below. Then came the rubble, tons of history and jagged granite raining down in a suffocating heap. The sound was a deafening cacophony of destruction, and then a sudden, terrifying silence. I lay pinned in the darkness, the scent of gunpowder and ancient dust filling my throat. My side burned with a searing, wet heat, and my legs were trapped beneath a slab of masonry that felt as heavy as the Inquisition's indoctrination. I reached for my blades, but my fingers met only grit and broken stone. Above me, I could hear the distant, muffled sounds of a new slaughter, the rebels' shouts and the desperate roars of shifters defending their home. The mission had failed before the first drop of royal blood could touch my steel. I was caught in a magical backfire of someone else's making, an assassin buried in the ruins of a kingdom she was supposed to dismantle. The shadows I had lived in my entire life were finally closing in, not as allies, but as a grave. My vision began to fray at the edges, the cold of the winter snow seeping through the cracks in the debris to find my skin. The last thing I felt was the vibration of footsteps overhead, heavy, rhythmic, and powerful, approaching the spot where I lay buried. Always the snow, I thought, as the darkness finally took me. I woke to the smell of cedar and ancient hearth fire, a far cry from the suffocating dust of the collapsed cellar. My first instinct was to reach for the twin blades at my hips, but my arms felt heavy, bound by a lethargy that wasn't quite exhaustion. I opened my eyes to find a ceiling of dark, polished oak and the soft flicker of amber light dancing across stone walls. This wasn't a dungeon or a grave. I was lying in a bed draped in furs that felt softer than anything the Inquisition had ever permitted. A sharp memory of the masonry crushing my ribs flared in my mind, yet when I shifted, the expected agony was gone. Instead, a strange, golden warmth hummed beneath my skin, centered at my side where the wound had been. I looked up and saw him. King Alistair Blackwood sat in a high-backed chair near the bed, his head resting in one hand while the other lay flat on the furs near my hip. He looked different without the crown and the distance of the high balcony. His face was etched with a profound weariness, and his skin was unnaturally pale, as if he had bled out without losing a drop of blood. As I stirred, he sat up, and for a moment, we stared at each other in a silence, so thick it felt like the snow outside. "You should be dead," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that vibrated in my chest. It wasn't an accusation, it was a simple observation of fact. I tried to sit up, my voice coming out as a broken rasp. "Why am I not?" He didn't answer immediately. He looked at his hand, the one that had been near me, and I saw a faint, fading golden light receding into his palm. He had used his own alpha spark, his very life force, to knit my flesh back together while the rebels were still being hunted through his halls. "My guards wanted to leave you in the rubble," he admitted, his eyes searching mine with an intensity that made me want to flinch. "They saw your Inquisition marks. They knew what you came here to do." "Then why?" I asked, the confusion gnawing at me more than the remnants of the pain. "I was ordered to kill you. I am the monster they sent to end your line." Alistair stood slowly, his movements stiff, as if the act of healing me had aged him a decade. He walked to the window, looking out at the blizzard that continued to bury the world in white. "I saw your eyes before the ceiling fell, Isolde Thorne," he said softly, using my name as if it weren't a curse. "You weren't looking at a target. You were looking at a man. And when the stone came down, you didn't cry out for your master. You just looked tired." He turned back to me, the golden light in his eyes flickering like a dying candle. "I am tired of killing monsters. I wanted to see if I could save one instead." I lay back against the furs, my heart beating with a rhythm that felt foreign, powered by a mercy I didn't know how to carry. The master had taught me that kindness was a lure and compassion was a lie, but as the king's heat lingered in my veins, the simple machinery of my mission began to stall. I was a tool of death healed by the hands of my prey, and for the first time in my life, the darkness of the Inquisition felt less like home and more like a cage. The golden warmth of Alistair's magic continued to thrum beneath my skin, a constant, physical reminder of the mercy I had been taught was a myth. I remained in the guest chambers for 2 days, watched by silent guards whose eyes held no malice, only a profound, guarded sorrow. When Alistair finally returned, he brought no weapons, only a tray of simple bread and a carafe of water. He sat by the hearth, the firelight catching the gray at his temples, a sign of age that the Inquisition claimed shifters reached only through bloodlust and dark rituals. "They tell us you lose your humanity when the moon rises," I said, my voice finally steady as I watched him tend to the flames. "They say you are mindless beasts who crave the scent of human marrow." Alistair didn't look up, his expression unreadable in the dancing shadows. "And what do your eyes tell you, Isolde? Do you see a beast? Or do you see a man trying to keep his people from freezing in a world that has turned its back on them?" I looked at his hands, the hands that had knit my broken ribs back together at the cost of his own strength. I thought of High Inquisitor Varkas, who had once broken my arm for missing a strike during training, calling it a lesson in the necessity of pain. The contrast was a jagged blade in my mind. Alistair spoke of his people not as a pack of predators, but as families who had farmed the valleys for centuries before the Inquisition branded their nature a sin. He spoke of Lady Genevieve and the rituals that kept the soil fertile and the winds calm, acts of creation that the master had twisted into tales of dark sorcery. "The Inquisition feeds on fear, Isolde," he said, finally meeting my gaze. "It is easier to kill a monster than it is to admit you are stealing the land of a neighbor." I felt the foundation of my life beginning to crumble, more violently than the fortress walls had during the blast. Every savage act I had been sent to avenge, every heresy I had been told to purge, felt suddenly like a mirrored reflection of the Inquisition's own cruelty. I had been raised to be a scalpel, told I was cutting away a cancer, but as Alistair described the songs his people sang to the stars, I realized I was just a knife in the dark. The empty eyes Varkas had praised in me were filling with a terrifying clarity. I saw the Alpha King not as a target, but as a mirror showing me the hollow shell of the woman I had become. The master had promised me freedom through service, but Alistair was offering me something much more dangerous: the truth. I looked at the twin blades resting on the table, my identity, and for the first time, I didn't want to touch them. The snow continued to fall outside, but the ice inside my heart was finally starting to crack. The silence of the room was broken not by sound, but by a pulse of cold, violet light. I reached into the hidden lining of my tunic and pulled out the communication stone, its jagged surface vibrating against my palm like a dying heartbeat. The light was aggressive, a rhythmic demand for blood that felt like Varkas's fingers tightening around my throat. In the Inquisition, silence was considered the first step toward heresy, and I had been silent for too long. I sat on the edge of the bed, the stone's glow casting long, distorted shadows against the oak-paneled walls that Alistair had provided for my comfort. The heat of the Alpha King's healing magic still hummed in my side, a soft, golden counterpoint to the freezing violet glare in my hand. As the stone pulsed again, the air around it grew heavy with the master's psychic imprint. I didn't need to activate it to know what it said. Report. Confirm the kill. Bring the heart. I thought of the ascension Varkas had promised me, the status, the purity, the supposed freedom from the red stains on my soul. But looking at the stone, I realized that my freedom was merely a longer leash. Every kill I had performed in the Master's name hadn't washed me clean. It had only made the darkness deeper. The room felt small, caught between two worlds. Outside, the winter solstice wind howled, carrying the scent of the shifter's wood smoke and the quiet resilience of a kingdom I had been sent to destroy. Inside, the violet light grew more frantic, the stone heating up until it began to blister my skin. Varkas was no longer just asking, he was commanding. He was reaching out through the dark to reclaim his tool. I looked at the twin blades resting on the table, their steel reflecting the sickly purple hue. They were the only identity I had ever known, the only voice I had ever been allowed to use. Slowly, I closed my fingers over the glowing stone, feeling the bite of its heat. I could speak the words now. I could tell him the king was weakened, that the fortress was in disarray, and that the ascension was within my grasp. Instead, I squeezed until the violet light was smothered by my grip.
I didn't speak.
I didn't confirm the kill. I watched as the stone eventually went dark, its energy spent, leaving me in the soft, flickering amber light of Alistair's hearth. The silence that followed was the loudest thing I had ever heard. I was no longer a shadow of the Inquisition. I was a traitor, a ghost without a master, and for the first time in my life, the weight of the decision felt like the beginning of a soul. The peace of the Iron Kingdom shattered not with a blast, but with a sudden, suffocating chill that swept down from the northern peaks. I stood on the ramparts beside King Alistair, watching as the horizon began to bleed a familiar, sickly violet light. It was the glare of 1,000 Inquisition lanterns, a holy purge army marching through the mountain pass with a precision that turned my blood to ice. High Inquisitor Varkas had not waited for my report. He had come to claim the Alpha King's head himself, and he had brought the full weight of the Inquisition shadow with him. I felt Alistair's gaze on me, heavy and questioning. The golden warmth he had gifted my body flared in response to the approaching threat, a physical warning of the darkness I had once called home. I could no longer hide behind the safety of the King's mercy. The silence I had chosen when the communication stone glowed was now a screaming admission of guilt. "They are here because of me," I said, my voice barely a whisper against the rising wind. I didn't look at him. I couldn't bear to see the betrayal in the eyes of the man who had healed me. "Varkas doesn't just want your stone, Alistair. He wants to prove that mercy is a weakness. He sent me to be the blade in your back, to infiltrate your halls under the guise of an ascension that was nothing more than a death sentence for your people." Alistair didn't flinch, his eyes fixed on the violet line of the approaching army. "I knew what you were the moment I pulled you from the stone, Isolde. Then why keep me here?" I turned to him, the desperation finally breaking through my assassin's mask. "I am a traitor to my kind and a threat to yours. I am the reason that army is at your border. I didn't confirm the kill, and now the master has come to finish it himself." The king finally looked at me, and there was no anger in his expression, only the same weary resolve I had seen during the solstice. "You are not the reason they are here, Isolde. They have been coming for us for centuries. You are simply the first one of them who stayed to see the sun rise." Below us, the shifters began to howl, a mournful, defiant sound that echoed through the valley as the Inquisition's war machines crested the final ridge. The snow began to fall again, but it was gray and heavy with the soot of the Master's black powder fires. I reached for the twin blades at my belt, feeling their cold, familiar weight. I had revealed my betrayal, and in doing so, I had severed the last tether to my past. I was a ghost without a master, standing in the shadow of a purge I had helped invite, ready to fight for a king I was supposed to kill. The iron gates groaned as the first wave of the Inquisition's vanguard breached the outer courtyard, their silver-etched armor gleaming with a cold, predatory light. I stepped into the breach alone, my twin blades drawn and humming with a lethal anticipation I had once used to serve the master. Behind me, Alistair leaned heavily against a stone pillar, his face ghostly pale from the life force he had expended to mend my broken body. He needed time for his alpha spark to reignite, and time was the only currency I had left to give. The men facing me weren't just soldiers. They were my brothers in arms, the same faceless shadows I had trained with in the silent halls of the Inquisition. They moved with a synchronized, mechanical grace, their eyes devoid of anything but the mission. To them, I was a broken tool, a malfunction in the Master's grand design. I didn't wait for them to strike. I became a blur of steel and motion, a whirlwind of desperation and newfound purpose. The clash of metal on metal rang out like a funeral knell through the snowy courtyard. I parried a killing blow meant for the king's throat, my blades sparking against the silvered pikes of my former kin. Every strike I landed felt like a severing of a ghost limb, a violent rejection of the indoctrination that had defined my existence. I wasn't just fighting men, I was fighting the shadow of the woman I used to be. The snow beneath my boots turned a jagged crimson as the vanguard pressed forward, their violet lanterns casting long, distorted shadows that seemed to claw at the stone. Isolde. Alistair's voice was a low, pained rasp, but I didn't turn. I couldn't. A spear point grazed my shoulder, a biting reminder of the mortality Alistair had so recently restored to me. I drove my elbow into a soldier's throat and spun, my blade shearing through an armored plate with a precision that made the Master's praise echo in my mind like a curse. I ignored the sting of the cold and the burn in my lungs, focusing only on the rhythm of the duel. I was the shield now, the barrier between the purity of the Inquisition's hate and the man who had shown me the truth of a soul. The vanguard faltered, surprised by the ferocity of a traitor who fought not for an order, but for a life. I saw the violet light of Varkas's command stone flickering in the distance, a frantic demand for my execution. But as the snow continued to fall, bearing the footprints of the army, I felt the golden warmth in my side flare into a steady, defiant heat. I wasn't an assassin anymore. I was the final line of defense for a king who had given me a reason to breathe, and I would hold this gate until the world itself turned to ice. Inside the inner sanctum, the air grew thick with the scent of crushed herbs and ozone, a sharp contrast to the metallic tang of blood that clung to my cloak. Lady Genevieve stood at the center of the chamber, her hands outstretched as she began the ritual to anchor the spiritual remnants of her people. A low, humming sound began to vibrate through the floor, not a song, but an ancient call that seemed to pull at the very marrow of my bones. Translucent figures, the soft lights of the fallen, began to gather around her like trapped stars, casting an ethereal glow that pushed back the creeping violet shadows of the Inquisition. I stood at the threshold of the sanctum, my twin blades heavy in my hands and my breath hitching in my lungs. Behind me, the ritual was a delicate thread of life. Before me, the corridor was a darkened throat through which the Master's remaining forces would try to tear their way. The Primal Heart stone within the king had stabilized my own pulse, and I could feel it beating in time with the ritual's rhythm, as if it recognized the lights Genevieve was beckoning home. The first of Varkas's elite inquisitors appeared at the end of the hall, their movements jagged and frantic. They didn't speak. They were driven by a desperate, holy fury to extinguish the light before it could take root. I met them at the door, my steel clashing against their silvered maces in a spray of sparks that lit the oppressive silence. Every step they took toward Genevieve was a step I answered with a strike, my body acting as a living shield for a process I barely understood but finally believed in. The violet light of the Inquisition's command stones pulsed with a sickening intensity, trying to drown out the soft, golden radiance behind me. I felt the fatigue of the previous duel clawing at my limbs, but the empty eyes I once possessed were now filled with the sight of the spirits floating like stardust. I was no longer an assassin waiting for the rain to stop. I was a guardian standing in the center of a storm. Genevieve's voice rose, the ancient sound becoming a firm command that shook the very foundation of the fortress. I drove my blade through the chest of the last Inquisitor to reach the door, my heart hammering with the weight of a dead world's hope. The corridor was a graveyard of silver and silk, but the inner sanctum remained untouched, a sanctuary of light held together by the blood on my hands and the mercy in my soul. The violet glare of the Inquisition's lanterns finally flickered and died as the ritual reached its crescendo, the holy purge retreating into the gray shadows of the mountain pass. High Inquisitor Varkas was gone, repelled by a light he could neither understand nor extinguish, leaving behind only the broken silver of his vanguard and a silence that felt heavier than the battle. I stood at the threshold of the inner sanctum, my twin blades lowered at last, their steel dull and notched from the price of the night. The empty eyes the master had once cultivated in me were now burning with the sting of salt and exhaustion, watching as the translucent figures of the fallen merged into the stone, anchoring the soul of the Iron Kingdom once more. The snow had stopped falling. The sky at the horizon was no longer the sickly purple of a command stone, but a pale, bruised blue that heralded the first true dawn I had ever seen without the weight of a mission. I felt the golden warmth in my side, the king's gift, settle into a steady, quiet hum, no longer a frantic warning but a permanent part of my rhythm. King Alistair approached me, his step slow but no longer pained. The Primal Heart stone at his chest glowed with a soft, reclaimed power as he looked at the graveyard of the corridor and then at me. He didn't see the tool of the Inquisition or the monster the master had built. He saw the woman who had bled to buy him time. "The Inquisition is broken here, Isolde," he said, his voice a low resonance that seemed to carry the relief of the entire realm. "Varkas will tell his tales of heresy and betrayal, but the truth is written in the stone you defended." I looked down at my hands, still stained with the red of my former brothers-in-arms. "I am a traitor to the only world I ever knew, Alistair. I have no title. I have no shadow to hide in anymore." Alistair reached out, not to take a weapon, but to place a hand on my shoulder, his touch radiating the same heat that had saved my life on the beach of my own morality. "You were ordered to kill a king, but you chose to save a people. The Inquisition gave you a blade and a mask, but I offer you a home and a purpose." He paused, the first light of the sun catching the silver in his hair. "You are no longer an assassin, Isolde Thorne. From this day forward, you are the shield of the realm." I looked out at the rocky coast and the sparse vegetation of the valley, realizing the rain of blood in my mind had finally stopped. I didn't know how to be a shield, and I didn't know how to live in the light, but as the king stood beside me, I realized I finally knew how to breathe. The ascension Varkas had promised was a lie, but this quiet dawn amidst the ruins was real. I was a ghost no longer. I was home.